On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the bill.
Calendar number 266, H.R. 1, an act to provide for reconciliation pursuant to Titles 2 and 5 of the concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2018.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that Senator Wyden or his designee be recognized to offer a motion to commit the bill, text of which is at the desk. I further ask that the time until 8 p.m. be equally divided between the leaders or their designees, and that at 8 p.m. the Senate vote in relation to the motion to commit with no intervening action or debate, and that following the disposition of the Wyden motion, the Majority Leader be recognized.
Is there objection? Without objection.
President.
Senator from Oregon.
Ask unanimous consent that the following individuals in my personal and Finance Committee offices be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the Congress: Claudette Yazbek, Carlin Yallop, Lawrence Doppel, Jonathan Harris, Robert Kaus, and Michael Cecil.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I call up the motion that I have at the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
The Senator from Oregon, Mr. Wyden, moves to commit the bill H.R. 1 to the Committee on Finance with instructions to report the same back to the Senate in 3 days, not counting any day on which the Senate is not in session, with changes that, 1, are within the jurisdiction of such committee, and 2, eliminate provisions that would raise taxes on millions of middle-class taxpayers.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for 6 additional full-floor access passes to be equally divided between the majority and the minority during the consideration of H.R. 1 for the following staffers. For the majority, Eric Uland, Rebecca Cole, Paul Vinovich, and for the minority, Mike Jones, Jill Harrelson, Josh Smith. Finally, that Natalie Rico, a fellow in Senator Sanders' office, be granted floor privileges during the consideration of H.R. 1.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Wyoming.
This is an historic day as the Senate begins consideration of tax reform that will help boost America's economy, that will create more jobs, and that will leave more money in people's paychecks. The House and Senate passage last month of the fiscal year 2018 budget resolution marked an important first step toward tax relief for American families and job creators that will jumpstart economic growth. The resolution gave the Senate Finance Committee the headroom to come up with comprehensive tax reform, and it instructed the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee to save $1 billion. Finance Committee Chairman Hatch and Energy Committee Chairman Murkowski both deserve praise for developing legislative recommendations that fit with the budget resolution's reconciliation instructions, and I thank them for their efforts. Yesterday, the Senate Budget Committee took the next step by combining the legislative recommendations from the Finance and the Energy and Natural Resources Committees and reporting the combined bill to the full Senate for consideration. This put our nation one step closer to real tax reform while advancing American energy security. It is past time for us to act. A lot of things have changed since the last major tax reform in 1986. And unfortunately, our tax code hasn't kept pace with those changes. It's an outdated mess that's hurting American workers and holding our economy back. That's why we need tax reform that will make our system simpler and fairer and allow people to keep more of what they earn. The bill before us will do that. It will help grow the economy. It will help create jobs. And it will ensure that hardworking Americans aren't missing available tax relief. This bill also will provide relief to small family-owned businesses. We want to make sure that small businesses, which currently employ the majority of the private sector in Wyoming and are the backbone of our communities all over the country, have the opportunity to grow and provide more jobs. If you care about jobs, If you care about American companies staying here and being able to compete globally, then you should also care about reforming our business tax system. America has the 4th highest corporate rate in the world. We need to encourage companies to bring back their overseas money to increase the number of jobs here in the United States. Lowering our uncommonly high and uncompetitive business tax rate would be one of the quickest ways to solve the problem. It's time we make America a more inviting place to invest, to do business, and to create jobs. We heard a lot of rhetoric yesterday in our committee meeting where we reported this bill, and I expect we'll be hearing a lot more of the same arguments over the next couple of days. So I want to address some of the claims made by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle yesterday. Several members complained that there have been 0 hearings on this reconciliation legislation and that this has been a rushed process. Nothing could be further from the truth. The entire 2018 budget reconciliation process has been open, transparent, and subject to regular order, starting with the passage of the Senate budget resolution. The Senate Budget Committee marked up the budget over 2 days and accepted amendments from both sides of the aisle to make the resolution stronger. In fact, for the first time ever, the minority was given a copy of the chairman's bill 5 days prior to the start of the markup. According to many of my colleagues, it was one of the most transparent budget resolution markups in history. The budget resolution, complete with reconciliation instructions being used this week, was then debated on the floor in an open process that allowed every senator the opportunity to offer and vote on amendments to improve the resolution before its final passage. That set in motion the instructed committee's process for producing recommendations. Over the last 6 years, the Senate Finance Committee has held 70 hearings on how the tax code can be improved and streamlined to work better for all Americans. Earlier this month, the Senate Finance Committee held a 4-day markup before finally approving tax reform legislation designed to modernize our tax code. The markup lasted 23 hours and 34 minutes over the course of those 4 days. Of the more than 350 amendments filed, 69 were asked to be considered in committee. An additional 35 amendments offered by both Democrats and Republicans were included in the final bill reported out of committee. On November 2nd, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee held a hearing to receive testimony on the potential for oil and gas exploration and the development in the so-called 1002 area of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR. And on November 15th, after adopting a bipartisan amendment, the committee approved with bipartisan support legislation authorizing responsible development in the 1002 area and meeting the $1 billion reconciliation deficit reduction target. Let me explain what we're talking about here, Mr. President. ANWR is 19.3 million acres. It's about the size of South Carolina. The 1002 area is 1.57 million acres, about the size of Delaware. And the area within 1002 that we're talking about for development is just 2,000 acres, which is smaller than the Fargo, North Dakota airport. When the Budget Committee met yesterday, consistent with our responsibility under the Congressional Budget Act, we were only allowed to combine the recommendations of the two committees. We reported the combined bill to the full Senate. As provided by law, no amendments were allowed because under the Budget Act, our committee is prohibited from substantially changing either committee's approved recommendations. Now that this bill is on the floor, however, it'll be subject to the amendment process. For reconciliation bills like this, the amount of amendments that can be offered is unlimited. Several members yesterday accused us of no longer caring about overspending in the debt. Again, this is completely false. Better tax policy will boost the value of everything we produce, and this will mean more revenue for the federal government. The cost of this bill, that you will hear my colleagues on the other side of the aisle argue, assumes the bill has little effect on the economy. That assumption is based on the sluggish growth we've had recently. In 2016, annual GDP growth was 1.6%. But, Mr. President, our historical average growth is 3.2%. And under President Trump's efforts and the hope that he's brought to working Americans, our economy has grown at more than 3% the last 2 quarters. If we only get to 2.4% growth in the private sector, this bill will be paid for. And if we reach 3.2% growth, part of the debt will be paid down from the extra revenue that will be generated. We've tried stimulus, and it left us at the 1.6%. We've tried cutting, and in Washington, if you don't give the amount of increase that people are asking for, but you give them more money than they had last year, that's considered a cut. So cuts haven't worked here either. So what's the other option that we have? Growing the economy. I want to repeat, in 2016, the annual GDP growth was 1.6%. But our historical average growth is 3.2%. And under President Trump's efforts and the hope he's brought to working Americans, our economy has grown at more than 3% the last 2 quarters. Without this, if we only get to 2.4% growth in the private sector, this bill will be paid for. I believe that we can reach the 3.2% growth, and part of the debt will be paid down from the extra revenue that will be generated. Now, some people will say that after tax cuts before that the deficit has gone up. I hope you check and see that the revenue has gone up, but the spending went up bigger. It's like somebody winning the lottery and spending their winnings twice. This reconciliation bill will make concrete reforms to the broken U.S. tax code and put the American economy back on a growth track. This tax plan is an investment in hardworking Americans, one that will produce more jobs, result in higher wages and a stronger and more competitive American economy. Now, you're probably going to hear a lot of screaming going on in speeches this week. Please don't confuse volume with veracity or truth. I look forward to working with my colleagues to help pass this bill that will not only benefit hardworking Americans, but will make our economy and our country stronger. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President,
Senator from Oregon.
I listened to the remarks of my colleague from Wyoming, the distinguished senator, and he said there were 70 hearings on taxes. I think it's important that the American people know that there was not one single hearing, not one, on this bill. There were no discussions of the specific provisions in this legislation. There was no hearing on the personal responsibility requirement in the Affordable Care Act that is so essential to that law and what we ought to be looking at strengthening in the years ahead with respect to cost containment. So I just want to set the record straight right at the outset of the debate, since I've heard once again that there were 70 hearings. I think it's important that the American people know that there was not one on this bill, and you contrast this to 1986 when Democrats and Republicans got together and there were more than 20 hearings, more than 20 discussions on specifics about how to work together and find common ground on this enormously important issue. Now, Mr. President, the Senate is 20 hours of debate away from a broken promise of truly historic proportions. This was supposed to be the year that the working people of America regained a powerful voice in Washington. Instead of a strong voice, what they got instead was a big con job. If this Republican tax bill passes, Washington is going to reach into the pockets of working Americans and cut a big check to multinational corporations, to tax cheats, and to the politically powerful and well-connected. The bill before the Senate would enshrine an economic double standard that makes permanent second-class treatment of Americans who work hard and do their best day in and day out to provide for their families. For the cops, for the nurses, for the mechanics, for those who work retail, this Republican tax plan is one big gamble. They don't get any special tax dodges, no Cayman Islands deals for them. Those folks are stuck clinging to the hope that they won't be among the millions hit with an immediate tax hike. Even for those lucky Americans who do see some benefit, there is bad news coming down the pike. All they get out of the Republican plan is the fleeting sugar high of temporary tax cuts. That's not the case, though, for the multinational corporations or powerful high flyers who wield the big political power in this town. Under this tax plan, the basic message to them is, you can pay what you want when you want to. And if you're lucky, really lucky, you may pay hardly anything at all. That certainly is not what working people were promised in the fall campaign of 2016. That's not what Republicans have spent month after month telling Americans that their tax plan would do. The Republican rhetoric doesn't match the reality of this tax plan. And every day we get news reports, frightening news reports, about the harm it's going to do to working people and the middle class. Just yesterday, I received a letter from the independent congressional tax experts, known as the Joint Committee on Taxation. And they gave us some really important information about the bill. Buried in one of those answers was information that ought to put a scare into millions of Americans who work hard every day to get ahead. This bill showers trillions of dollars on multinational corporations. But the fact is, these multinational corporations are already awash in cash. What it means, according to these independent congressional tax experts, is interest rates are going up. The Federal Reserve will have to tighten the screws of the economy. Here's the bottom line for what it means for a middle-class American in North Carolina or Oregon or anywhere else in the United States. If you want to buy a house, this bill is going to make it more expensive. If you want to buy a car, this bill is going to make it more expensive. If you want to get a credit card, this bill is going to make it more expensive. If you want to take out a student loan, this bill is going to make it more expensive. And it's not just harm for typical families. The cost of doing business is going to rise for the brewery owner or the tool and die maker who wants to build a new facility, purchase new equipment. They'd like to hire new workers, the ones that we're talking to, but they'll find the money they need to do it is getting drained by higher interest rates. In short, higher interest rates will wipe out the benefits of this bill for a lot of small businesses and add pain to the tax hikes that are going to hit millions of families. The only businesses and individuals who won't feel the effects I just described are those sitting on mountains of cash, those who will never need to borrow to get ahead. And that is just one of the latest, truly frightening details about what this destructive bill would do. Now, if there was any doubt remaining, it's clear, based on those tax experts, that individual working Americans and families are going to be on the hook for handouts to multinational corporations. Republicans have spent months shouting from the hilltops that they were bringing jobs back. The president made it a centerpiece of his campaign. Jobs are coming home, he said. Corporations that ship jobs overseas are going to be punished. The plight of so many mill towns and factory towns was over. It's too bad that those talking points from the stump speeches and interviews never made it into the proposals on paper, because the tax plan that is actually before the Senate does the opposite. Under the new notion of taxes for American companies overseas, be called a territorial system. Corporations will get a bigger tax cut if they lay off their American workers, their workers here in the United States, pack up and move abroad. It creates colossal new loopholes, a true bonanza of new tax gifts for the tax cheats, for the people who've got the sophisticated help to cut corners. When it comes to international tax rules, my view is the United States shouldn't get suckered into a race to the bottom with a bunch of no-tax, resort-lined islands to please the tax avoidance industry and their lobbyists. That is truly expensive competition in terms of taxpayer dollars and jobs. But this Republican plan forces working Americans to pay up. The tax experts that we rely on here in the Congress make it clear that the Republican corporate tax scheme loses revenue, but the individual tax changes raise revenue. That is a whole lot of tax lingo, Mr. President, for saying that working people are going to get fleeced so that multinational corporations can pay a lot less. Here's how it's going to work. More and more Americans will face a tax hike with every passing year. Stealthy tax tricks will force people into higher tax brackets over time, heaping a heavier burden on their shoulders. Millions of working Americans are going to lose their health care and their tax credits that make insurance affordable to them and their family. Put it all together, it's an immense amount of money being taken from people who are already walking an economic tightrope in North Carolina and Oregon and everywhere else, where they balance the food costs against the fuel bills and the fuel bills against the cost of housing. An immense amount of money is being taken from them and being handed to multinational corporations that ship jobs overseas. This is not a plan to create red, white, and blue jobs. This is not a plan to turn the lights back on in factories that went dark many years ago. This is a plan to sell out millions of Americans and American workers and their families, and the damage will get even worse when the deficit climbs into the stratosphere. And as I begin to touch on the deficit, Mr. President, I want to note that it didn't have to be this way. I wrote 2 full bipartisan federal income tax reform bills with our colleagues. I believe they were here before the senator from North Carolina joined us. Dan Coates, now the head of National Intelligence. Judd Gregg, the former Republican chair of the Budget Committee. He and I, the three of us, Senator Gregg first, then Senator Coates, we made changes to ensure that American companies could be competitive for red, white, and blue jobs. We understood that you had to have a competitive rate to grow those companies, but we certainly didn't create new breaks for shipping jobs overseas. And because I'm going to touch on the deficit now, our proposal was revenue neutral. So it didn't have to be this way. That's what Senator Manchin and Senator Kaine said yesterday, along with 17 Democrats. We wanted a bipartisan alternative that didn't create new incentives for shipping jobs overseas, that didn't jack up the deficit. But I certainly was surprised when I saw early on that Senate Republicans, who had given so many speeches about their concern about the deficit, said it's kind of okay with us if we have a net deficit of $1.5 trillion, and as the Joint Committee on Taxation has essentially indicated to me, it would be higher than that. All of the deficit hawks in the Republican Party just flew away. That was surprising because it seems like just yesterday, when the Congress couldn't buy lunch without a whole cast of Republican deficit hawks doing some pretty serious hollering about the deficit. But based on history, what's coming next is pretty predictable. We've seen the movie before. The deficit hawks come flying back after ideas like the one we're looking at in the Senate become law. We already heard the Speaker say, what's next? Entitlement reform, which means Medicare, Medicaid, anti-hunger programs. The Speaker said, that's what's next. That's next on the docket. Everybody listening ought to know that that's code for attack and multiple fronts on these kind of programs for the most vulnerable people in our country, the lifeline programs, the safety net programs that I've just described. What we're going to hear, because this is the script from earlier movies, is we got these big deficits. Oh my goodness, a lot of red ink. And America can't afford the safety net. And they'll say, we've got to do something. And instead of being willing to go after the people at the top, history says that the people who really face the burden of those deficit reductions are the most vulnerable. The first big legislative push after the Bush tax cut, for example, was an all-out assault on Social Security. And the fact that it was stopped doesn't mean that Medicare or Medicaid or other safety net programs like Social Security are going to be safe this time around. The policy on offer, in my view, is simply a disaster. It makes a mockery of the approach Ronald Reagan took with a big group of Democrats. And this bill, and I know so many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle admire President Reagan greatly. This bill is the opposite of what President Reagan did. What President Reagan did is he said to those big multinational corporations, I've got to ask you to give up some money in order to make sure that the middle class, the individual ratepayer, would get a fair shake. This is just the opposite. 180 degrees away from what Ronald Reagan did. We are going to have an amendment on the middle class here pretty soon. But what could be more stark than the fact that the tax cuts for the multinationals are permanent and the relief for the middle class is temporary? This bill is the opposite, the total opposite of what Ronald Reagan worked on in 1986. Now, our colleague, Senator Enzi, and I have worked with him often, and I'm sad to see us have such differing views on this, said that we've had 70 hearings. Well, I can tell you, the once storied Senate Finance Committee never even attempted once to craft a bipartisan bill. And we said for months that was our preference. That was what was stated in a letter that the vast majority of Senate Democrats signed. That's what we said when we were invited to the White House to meet with the president. We said it repeatedly. I mentioned the two bills I wrote. They're the only two bipartisan federal income tax reform bills. Only two we've had since 1986. And by the way, Mr. President, they didn't go as far as Ronald Reagan went. Ronald Reagan, in 1986, said, for purposes of taxes, a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. We're going to have the same rate for those who make money on investments that we do for those cops and nurses who get that wage, that ordinary income. And I've indicated on the floor that Senator Bradley, former New York Knick, and as I like to say, another tall Democrat who served on the Senate Finance Committee with a much better jump shot than mine, he's incredulous at this process. He's just slack-jawed when he asks about what's being done to bring both sides together. Senator Bradley and others on the Republican side in 1986 flew all over the United States to get together with senior Republicans and Jim Baker and Richard Darman and others to talk about the specifics of getting bipartisan tax reform together. You hear the stories and you see that's the way you tackle an issue like this. So Bill Bradley flew all over the country to work with Republicans to get a bipartisan tax reform bill. And right now, the majority on the Senate Finance Committee wouldn't walk down the corridor of the Dirksen building once to talk about anything resembling how we would put together a bipartisan proposal. So the process we have seen here makes a mockery out of Reagan-style reform. Now, some have asked, was this foreordained? Did it have to be? Well, I've already made it clear that I don't think it had to be. It's hard work putting together a bipartisan bill. Senator Gregg, for example, when he was here in the Senate, I think was one of Leader McConnell's top economic advisors. He's chairman of the Budget Committee, and we always used to say in our house, Judd Gregg is scary smart. But we sat next to each other on chairs in our office for almost 2 years to put together a bill. So it is heavy lifting, but it can be done. And a lot of that work was brought into other efforts since then. The question of the Bush proposal, bipartisan commissions, or a variety of ones. But it's pretty hard to do when the majority leader says on the first day, the very first day out, we're going to use the most partisan process, budget reconciliation, and in effect say what we're telling the other party is we don't want your ideas because we don't need your votes. And sometimes it got almost a little ridiculous because I know there were times when statements were made by the Republican leadership that no Democrats were interested in bipartisan tax reform, despite the fact that in the few instances where a White House official would call and ask our opinion, Senate Democrats would meet. That was the point of the press conference that was held yesterday with 17 Democrats from various parts of the country, as well as the legislation that I've described that was written. And by the way, in the work product that Republicans finally produced, they took some of the ideas from the bipartisan bills. For example, increasing the standard deduction. But we tripled the standard deduction without any takeaways, like the state and local deduction or the permanent exemptions. And what that meant is in the bipartisan bills, if you pass something like that, people adjust their wages, and immediately working class folks get hundreds and hundreds of dollars more in every paycheck. So not only were there no discussions, and I've seen Republican senators stand out on the floor sometimes and hold up a sign, what we're doing is widen Coates bill. Nothing could be further from the truth, whether it's on the international provisions I mentioned or the personal provisions. And I was so proud to stand with Senate Democrats in a meeting yesterday put together by Senators Manchin and Kaine, once again stating that it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, what's the rush to take taxes for multinational corporations from 35 to 20? Back when I was working with Senator Gregg and Senator Coates, the Republicans, we didn't have multinational corporations saying that we should go to 20. The difference between 25 and 20 is $500 billion. So my colleagues yesterday were saying, moderate Democrats, we're serious about tax reform, both on the individual and the corporate side. But it ought to be based on bipartisan give and take, not something like we have seen. Now, Republicans in Congress and the administration's top salesmen have spent months and months telling the American people that in the long run their bill is going to pay for itself with explosive growth. And they had cheerleaders. They are those who cooked up these phony growth forecasts based on revenue-neutral reform proposals that don't exist. But respected economists will tell you that tax cuts don't pay for themselves. And in fact, when we had a chance to have some discussion, not about a specific bill, but some ideas about taxes, the Republican economists who were before the Finance Committee said that the tax cuts wouldn't pay for themselves. The honest predictions say that any growth caused by this bill is going to be modest. And after they've spent years insisting, I can't tell you, Mr. President, how many times I heard this, that we would have dynamic scores. Republican senators are rushing the independent scorekeepers to try to get a thorough analysis, but we don't have it as we're on this floor debating the bill. And finally, we ought to forget that this bill has been getting a rewrite behind closed doors for weeks now. A number of my colleagues on the other side said what was important to them is that we have what's called regular order. Regular order is probably not a concept people talk about in too many coffee shops unless they traditionally get eggs or toast or something. But what it means is you have a process where both sides work together and you have a chance to discuss ideas and differing approaches are offered. We haven't had anything like that. We haven't had an open process with real debate and real amendments. What we've seen is a mad dash to pass a bill that can't stand scrutiny in broad daylight. If this bill really got scrutinized and had a chance to be examined, we'd see a lot of Americans coming to their senator and saying, "Senator, no way should you support that bill. What's on offer is a plan to force working people and middle-class families to pay for handouts to multinational corporations and tax cheats. This bill does not deserve to pass." My view is that it really doesn't deserve the ink that was used to print it on paper. The process that has culminated in the scramble to just drive it through with the most arbitrary process imaginable, I consider shameful. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Iowa?
Before I speak on taxes, I ask permission to speak in morning business on the subject of National Adoption Month, and I'd like to have it inserted in the record outside of the debate on the tax bill.
Without objection.
I rise today to commemorate November as National Adoption Month. During this month, we're reminded of the importance of adoption to so many families and children in Iowa and all across our country. As Americans are celebrating the season of Thanksgiving with family and friends, adopted families are celebrating with their new families, giving thanks, of course, for the joy of somebody they adopted. Since the first recognition of National Adoption Day 17 years ago, nearly 65,000 kids have been adopted on National Adoption Day, which is always celebrated the Saturday before Thanksgiving each year. In 2016 alone, over 4,700 adoptions were finalized on National Adoption Day. National Adoption Month is certainly a time to celebrate the joys of a new family. However, it is also a reminder of the obstacles that so many children may face. Nationally, there are over 425,000 children in foster care. Over 100,000 of these children are hoping to be adopted. In Iowa, there are about 1,000 kids in foster care who are eligible for adoption. This year, the special focus of National Adoption Month is older youth waiting to be adopted. Teenagers, unfortunately, face more difficulty in being adopted than younger children. As co-founder and co-chair of the Senate Caucus on Foster Youth, I've had the chance to hear directly from teenagers in foster care. In fact, our Senate Caucus on Foster Youth has 3 seminars every year just listening to older youth in the foster care system, particularly those that are about ready to age out. These young people tell me that more than anything else, they want a loving family. They tell me they need a family and that nobody is too old to be adopted. The support that parents provide to teens is critical to navigating the transition to adulthood. From making decisions about higher education to finding a job or buying a car. A loving family continually provides the support that teens need to succeed. Congress must continue to work towards policies that help make adoption a reality for our foster youth. We must work to ensure that all children, no matter their circumstances, have a permanent, loving home and consistent, caring adults in their lives. I'm glad that the Senate preserved the adoption tax credit in the tax reform legislation, and I'm hopeful that Congress will continue to work on policies that promote adoption and improves the lives of those in foster care. As National Adoption Month comes to an end tomorrow, I thank all those who work to improve the lives of children. I thank advocates for children who tirelessly work to make adoption possible, and I thank adoptive parents and families for opening their hearts and homes. Now, as far as the tax bill is concerned, the last time Congress modernized the tax code, it was 1986. That's more than 30 years, quite obvious to anybody who can subtract. In the generation since, the tax code has grown out of control. It's been a dream come true for who? The professionals in accounting and the lobbyists that protect the loopholes. But it happens to be a real nightmare for most Americans. And I would say for most members of Congress, as you read regularly, very few members of Congress do their own taxes. The outdated tax code helps the powerful and the well-connected, but hurts American workers. It hurts American industry, and it hurts Americans' ability to compete with the rest of the world, and that means lower wages and less employment. The bill passed out of the Finance Committee moves us very much in the right direction to make our tax code simpler, fairer, and more competitive. At the heart of the legislation is a middle-class tax cut. A typical family of four with 2 children making $59,000 a year could see a tax cut of more than $1,700. Very significant tax relief. But you would never know it by listening to the rhetoric of my colleagues of the other political party. They have repeatedly recited the tired lines that Republicans are only interested in giving tax cuts to the wealthy. In fact, they began pushing that narrative even before this bill was written, going way back to September, started analyzing a bill that didn't even exist. It was a charge made by a document that was put out called the Big Six Framework. And framework is no piece of legislation. It merely provided guidelines for tax writing committees to start from. The Partisan Tax Policy Center then filled the gaps with policy assumptions and crafted an analysis to fit their narrative, their analysis of a piece of legislation that hadn't even been written. The problem is their narrative hasn't changed, but the Finance Committee provided policy details that they should have used to change their narrative, but they still keep with the same old rhetoric. I think even the Tax Policy Center would have to agree that the Finance Committee product differs drastically from the underlying assumptions of their initial analysis. So I'm going to try to compare what a tax center policy says about tax law that we ought to pass compared to our bill. And you'll see there seems to be a real closeness of some of the ideas that ought to be done that we get from the left that are in this bill, but they don't even recognize it. The Finance Committee used all the available tools granted under the unified framework to target more relief to middle-income taxpayers and retain the progressivity of the income tax. Let's take a look at some of the major features of the finance bill and how they provide relief for the nation's middle class and low-income earners. First, it nearly doubles the standard deduction, which means that many lower-income Americans will be removed from the tax rolls completely, and tax filing season will be simpler for millions more. Second, it doubles the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000 and moderately increases its refundability. Both of these are made possible in a large part by repealing personal exemptions. Personal exemptions for taxpayers and spouses help increase the standard deduction, and the personal exemptions for children helped with increasing the child tax credit. Interestingly enough, these provisions mirror a proposal put out by the left-wing Tax Policy Center in December just last year. Nearly identical to the finance bill, the very liberal Tax Policy Center paper argued for repealing personal exemptions, nearly doubling the standard deduction and increasing the child tax credit to $2,012. According to the authors of the Liberal Tax Policy Center proposal, such a proposal change would, quote, reduce complexity, remove inequities, and mitigate marriage penalties. That's exactly what the bill before the Senate does. But they don't seem to recognize that, but they sure wanted that as a goal last year. The fact is, these changes provide more tax relief to the middle class and at the same time simplify the tax code. As the Liberal Tax Policy Center paper points out, the value of the personal exemption is largely dependent on the tax bracket of the taxpayer. The higher the tax bracket, the more benefit that comes from the personal exemption. In comparison, the child tax credit generally lowers a taxpayer's tax liability dollar for dollar, regardless of the tax bracket. As a result, repealing personal exemption in favor of expanding the child tax credit makes the tax code more progressive and targets more relief to lower and middle income taxpayers. Admittedly, there are some differences between what was suggested by the Liberal Tax Policy Center and what is in the bill before us. Its proposal would have been more generous on the refundable feature of the child tax credit. But on the opposite end, they would have made the child tax credit available to everyone, even including millionaires. The finance bill is less generous to the affluent because it phases out the credit for married taxpayers with incomes over $500,000. You would think the other side, meaning the Democratic Party, finding fault with this bill, would offer some credit for taking this rather progressive approach to providing family tax relief. But no, they continue repeating their line over and over that this bill is a tax cut for the wealthy. Another major feature of the finance bill that provides relief to middle class and lower income earners is the reduction of the tax rates for middle class, middle bracket taxpayers. First, it retains the 10% bracket, which many on the other side expressed concern about being repeated based on the Big Six framework. So they were wrong in using the framework, but they haven't admitted that. Next, it lowers the current law 15% bracket to 12% and expands its applicability. Additionally, it reduces what is essentially the current law bracket of 25 down to 22 and what is essentially today's current law 28% bracket to a much wider 24% bracket. These rate reductions target tax relief to the very heart of Americans' middle class. Now, you may be wondering how this middle class tax relief bill will be financed, largely by repealing the state and local tax deduction, also known as SALT deduction. Our colleagues on the other side have tried to argue the repeal of the state and local tax deduction as a tax increase on middle class. Nothing further could be from the truth, considering the reduced tax brackets I just discussed in combination with the higher standard deduction and the double child tax credit. The repeal of the state and local tax deduction is actually a very key piece of this legislation that makes the middle class tax cuts possible. The state and local tax deduction overwhelmingly benefits the so-called wealthy that our colleagues on the other side vehemently argue should receive no tax benefits under this bill. And I'm going to tell you now how the liberal elements in this town see the state and local tax deduction as something that should have gone away anyway, and now they're complaining because we're doing away with it. So I don't want you to take my word. Here are several partisan think tanks have said about the state and local tax deduction in the past. According to the Tax Policy Center, remember that's that left-wing organization finding fault with a bill even before it was written, about 40% of the state and local tax deduction benefits go to taxpayers with incomes exceeding $500,000. So we do away with the state and local tax deduction because it benefits wealthy people and they don't give us any credit for it. Keep in mind that tax filers with incomes of $500,000 or more only make up about 1% of all tax filers, making it a very lopsided benefit. Here's what the very left-wing Center for American Progress has said about the state and local tax deduction. Quote, the deduction for state and local taxes disproportionately benefits high-income taxpayers, property owners, and residents of high-tax states. That's because these groups pay the most taxes at the state and local level. It also benefits high-income taxpayers because any kind of deduction is worth more to people in the high tax brackets than the low tax brackets. Now, I just got done quoting the Center for American Progress that said the state and local tax deduction ought to be done away with because it benefits wealthy people. And yet they complain to us that our tax bill is a tax benefit for the wealthy. To further illustrate how who eliminating the state and local tax benefit really hits, I'd like to highlight a recent Bloomberg article titled, quote, tax hike fears trigger talk of exodus from Manhattan and Greenwich. Now, this article is about concerns from middle class, is not about concerns from middle class police officers or teachers on repeal of the state and local tax deduction. Instead, it highlights concerns from wealthy hedge fund managers who may now consider moving out of the high-tax state of New York. So here's the Bloomberg article, quote, "The problem for Connecticut hedge fund set, and more broadly for a lot of Wall Street crowd, is that Republican proposals in both the House and Senate would drive up taxes for many high earners in the New York City area by eliminating the deduction for most state and local taxes. An individual making a yearly salary of $1 million would owe the Internal Revenue Service an additional $21,000, end of quote. So we, in this legislation, repeal that deduction and make these people, this person making a yearly salary of $1 million pay $21,000 more taxes, and it's and liberal groups are proposing doing away with it, and we put it in our bill so that we don't let these wealthy people get the benefit of the tax deduction, and they don't recognize it. So I ask my colleagues on the left, are you prepared to go to bat over SALT deductions for millionaire hedge fund managers? From listening to my Democratic colleagues' rhetoric, I am really surprised by this article. I thought Republicans were all about tax cuts for the wealthy and giveaways to Wall Street. But this article suggests otherwise. In fact, these types of taxpayers are likely to experience sizable tax hikes under the proposal on the Senate floor now. According to the Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, by 2023, nearly 30% of taxpayers with incomes exceeding $1 million will experience a tax hike. That does not sound like a giveaway to the wealthy to me. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
I agree with my colleagues that we need tax reform, but we need tax reform that simplifies the tax code, that bolsters the middle class, and that helps small businesses create jobs. Now, I think we can do that, and we can do it in a fiscally responsible way, but we need to work together, Republicans and Democrats, as they did the last time we did tax reform. Unfortunately, these priorities are not reflected in the bill that's before us. Instead, it is a partisan, fiscally irresponsible giveaway to the wealthy and the largest corporations in this country, and it comes at the expense of the middle class and small businesses. Now, we know that the wealthiest Americans will see massive tax breaks from this bill, including President Trump himself. In fact, the New York Times has estimated that President Trump and his family would save more than $1 billion from this tax bill. And how does this legislation pay for these tax cuts? Well, it asks today's middle class and future generations to foot the bill. The nonpartisan analysis from the Joint Committee on Taxation has found that the bill will raise taxes on millions of middle-class families making less than $75,000 a year. The bill sunsets any middle-class tax breaks in 2026, and at the same time, it makes tax breaks for large corporations permanent. It increases the national debt by $1.5 trillion, and I think the headline in the current Forbes magazine says it all. It says, GOP tax bill is the end of all economic sanity in Washington. As more people look at this bill, they're beginning to see how it will hurt middle-class families across the country. Over the past few weeks, I've heard more and more concern from people throughout New Hampshire, and I just want to take a minute to highlight some of these concerns. I met recently with the New Hampshire realtors and home builders. They are major advocates for home ownership in New Hampshire. They told me that this bill is nothing short of an attack on home ownership. In particular, they're concerned about the impact of repealing the state and local tax deduction. That will be a huge hit to middle-class families in New Hampshire. Right now, more than 200,000 Granite State homeowners use the state and local tax deduction so that they're not double taxed. That's about a third of taxpayers in New Hampshire. And it's particularly important to us where property taxes account for 66% of all state and local taxes. That's a higher share than any other state in the country. Homeowners are also concerned about proposals to limit the mortgage interest deduction, including on home equity lines of credit, where homeowners in New Hampshire are going to get hurt more than nationally because we have approximately 14% of homeowners who have a home equity line of credit. That's compared to 3.8% nationally. The result is, according to the realtors and the home builders, that home values will decline significantly. According to the Association of Realtors, this bill will put downward pressure on home values by as much as 18% in New Hampshire and 10% nationally. And if we look at this chart, this is for New Hampshire, but you can extrapolate this across the rest of the economy. If we look at this tax bill, this is the impact on homeowners in New Hampshire. It's going to be, values are going to be reduced by about 18%. That's equivalent to what we saw after the financial meltdown in 2008, where, again, we had about that same reduction in property values, about 18%. That is a huge hit for us in New Hampshire and for people across the country. You know, I thought the realtors put it very well. They said, it is simply unfair to ask homeowners who pay 83% of all federal income taxes to take a greater tax burden so that the biggest corporations in this country can have steep tax cuts. It doesn't make sense. I've also heard significant concern from students, colleges, and businesses that this bill will raise taxes on students trying to get the skills they need to get ahead. And you know, that's really crazy because when we do that, we don't create the workforce we need for the future. The House bill, for example, would eliminate the ability of individuals to deduct the interest on their student loans, and it would tax graduate students on tuition assistance. I heard from a graduate student who right now is making $20,000 a year in a stipend. That's what he's trying to live on. If this bill goes into effect, he will pay $5,000 of that in taxes. It doesn't make sense. We need to be encouraging our students to get graduate degrees and higher education degrees so they can take on the jobs of the future. And again, in New Hampshire, it's a particular problem where we have student loan debt that is higher than the national average. For the graduating class of 2016, New Hampshire had the highest per capita student loan debt in the country, and the average debt for New Hampshire graduates was $36,367. And we know that nationally, student loan debt has roughly tripled since 2004 to a staggering $1.3 trillion. That's higher than the total credit card debt. And what this legislation is likely to do is to make that worse for young people who are trying to get out of college, have their student loans paid, get married, start families, buy a house. If they continue to have this impact, they're not going to be able to do any of those things. The top challenge that faces New Hampshire businesses and so many businesses across this country is finding skilled workers. The last thing we should be doing is making education more expensive. I also serve as the ranking member on the Senate Small Business Committee. Small businesses employ more than half of our workforce. They make up more than 99% of all employers. We need to work in a bipartisan way to enact tax reform that supports our small businesses. Again, this bill, unfortunately, doesn't provide meaningful reform for small businesses and the problems they're facing with the tax code. First of all, this bill doesn't address the top issue that we've heard from small businesses. That's simplification and cutting of red tape in our tax code. For entrepreneurs, time is one of their most valuable resources, and every wasted hour spent filling out forms or navigating confusing tax rules is an hour they can't spend innovating, marketing, and growing their businesses. The tax system is so difficult to navigate that 89% of small businesses turn to outside tax preparers to fill out their forms and file their returns. The compliance burden for small businesses is 67% higher than it is for large businesses, and it costs about $18 billion annually. Tax reform should be an opportunity to help small businesses focus on what they do best, and that's running their business. Instead, this bill will result in even more red tape and complexity. According to a former Joint Committee on Taxation economist, if this bill becomes law, and I quote, Treasury will be writing regulations and Congress will be enacting technical corrections for years. There are more ticking time bombs in this bill than in a Roadrunner cartoon. And a recent poll of small business owners from Businesses for Responsible Tax Reform found that a majority of them oppose the plan. So this is polling that's just been done in the last week or so. 61% oppose, only 28% support. Small businesses are even more concerned about the impact of this tax bill on our debt and deficits. In fact, 61% of small business owners oppose raising the debt by $1.5 trillion to pay for tax cuts. Increasing the debt will inhibit our ability to address the real challenges facing small businesses, like educating a skilled workforce, building out broadband in rural areas, and fixing our broken infrastructure. And then there's the repeal of the individual mandate, which is part of this tax proposal. According to CBO, repealing the individual mandate, as this bill does, would cause 13 million Americans to become uninsured by 2027, and it would sharply raise premiums for those who purchase insurance in the individual market. Now, we've heard from our colleagues that they think that including the Alexander Murray legislation would help address that. But that's not designed to address the underlying health care bill that we have in this country. All that will do is address the uncertainty in the marketplace. Repealing the individual mandate is going to deny health insurance to millions of Americans. It's going to cost middle-income families more, and ultimately it's going to have an impact on people's ability to provide for their families, on the long-term health of this nation. That is not the kind of investment we should be making in the future of this country. There are many more issues with this tax bill, but my time is limited. But if we look at who's opposed to this bill, so many organizations, the realtors, the home builders, the AARP, the Fraternal Order of Police, they've all come out in opposition, and that's just to name a few. I've heard from nearly 3,000 Granite Staters who've expressed their opposition with the impact of this bill. And as more and more people have a chance to read it, that number is going to continue to grow. You know, I want to work with my colleagues here. I think Republicans and Democrats should genuinely reform the tax code. It's long overdue, but we need to do it in a way that's transparent, that looks at where we want to go in the future, what we need to be investing in this country. We need to work in a bipartisan way that puts the middle class and small businesses first, and that doesn't leave a massive debt for our children and grandchildren. And if we pass this legislation, that is exactly what we're going to be doing, leaving future generations to deal with a massive debt without the benefits of the investment that we should be making in this country. So it is a sad day for America, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Thanks, Mr. President. I'm honored to follow my distinguished colleague from New Hampshire and begin actually where she finished. This massive tax cut has indeed so many ticking time bombs that are unknown at the moment because it has been rushed and rammed through this body as well as the House without the kind of regular order that should be given the intense scrutiny and attention that is due a historic, massive measure of this kind. And the idea that it has regular order is absolutely absurd. If this is regular order, it is surely regular order light. There have barely been the most cursory of hearings, barely an excuse for hearings, no real markup, no real opportunity for the public to be heard, no real scrutiny of the complicated and numerous provisions that will affect people for years, decades, maybe generations to come. The last tax cut was in 1985, the last so-called reform, passed in the mid-1980s, involved scores of hearings and meetings and sessions for the public to be heard, dwarfing, making a mockery of this process. This process has been, in fact, a mockery of democracy. It is a classic bait and switch, a promise that is unfulfilled, a tax cut initially for people that then disappears after a couple of years when the wealthy continue to enjoy their tax cuts. There are winners and losers in this measure. Let's be very blunt. The winners are the wealthiest. The losers are the middle class. The winners are special interests. The losers are the American people. The winners are people who already have it made. The losers are people who want to fulfill the American dream and make it for themselves. People are pulling up the ladder for others to climb and make it real for them. The measure that we have before us is a result of a promise, middle-class tax cuts. And that promise was made by Donald Trump, who said also that he would not benefit. And he sent his small business administrator, Linda McMahon, to Connecticut to say, quote, everyone will experience a tax cut, end quote. This plan is a scam. Yes, some people will receive a tax cut initially, but if you earn less than $75,000 within the next decade, you will be worse off under this plan, and that means in Connecticut, 468,200 taxpayers in the bottom 80% of income distribution will experience a tax hike under this plan. The majority of people in Connecticut are losers, even though there may be a wealthy segment at the very top of the income distribution level that are winners. Our children and grandchildren are surely losers because they will inherit the whirlwind of additional debt. $1.5 trillion underestimates the amount of debt that will be added. I saw a cartoon in one of the newspapers that showed a rowboat filled with water, and one of the characters said to the other, drill another hole in the bottom of the boat to let the water out. And the sea was the debt sea. That's what this measure does. It fills our boat, but not only ours, our children and grandchildren's boats with additional debt. They are losers, even though the wealthiest are winners. And the losers include also first responders. Earlier this month, the president of the Fraternal Order of Police wrote a letter to the House and the Senate leadership urging members of Congress to protect the state and local deduction as it is. This measure eliminates that state and local deduction devastatingly for Connecticut, but also for first responders and firemen and police across the country, our teachers who depend on the adequacy of federal funding for essential services, which will be reduced because there's no incentive for state and local taxes. They can't be deducted anymore. States like Connecticut, New York, California, we know are the losers, and our middle class taxpayers are losers. That's why the National Education Association has found that gutting state and local tax deduction will seriously harm already underfunded public education, risking nearly 250,000 education jobs, including over 5,000 teacher jobs in the state of Connecticut. And it'll lead to about $250 billion in cuts to public education over the next decade. And while we're talking about education, eliminating the deduction for interest on student loans, what could be more stupid at a time when we are encouraging young people to invest in their futures, and we should be investing in them. Ultimately, also, the losers are our job creators, the folks who need infrastructure, which will go unrepaired, our roads, bridges, railroads, VA facilities, broadband, airports and ports, all of them desperately in need of rebuilding, not just repair, but true rebuilding and modernization and innovation. There's no requirement or opportunity here for repatriation of the trillions of dollars parked overseas, no provision for any sort of incentive for companies to repatriate and invest in an infrastructure bank. And so we will see, continue to see, neglect and disregard for that very important infrastructure. It is clear who will be the winners, despite all these losers, corporations that move overseas to evade taxes and benefit from special interest loopholes to lower their effective tax rates are going to be very richly rewarded. Senate Republicans have decided to open the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for oil and gas drilling. Those special interests, they're winners. The bill borrows $1.5 trillion so that those special interests and corporations can have those benefits, but it will also line the pockets of those corporate CEOs, not just the corporations, but the CEOs. That's equivalent to the cost of all veterans' health care and benefits payments to every single veteran in America over the next decade. With $1.5 trillion, by the way, you could also pay off all the student loan debt in America. Think of the difference in lives that would make. Think of all the young students, debt-free. Think of the vistas and the dreams that could be fulfilled. Think of the economic growth that would be generated. And think also of, again, the false promises and the bait and switch. When corporate CEOs were asked by the President's chief economic advisor, Gary Cohn, how many of you will create jobs with these corporate tax cuts? Nary a hand went up in the audience. A picture that says 1,000 words. I end my words now simply with the warning that Americans, far from buying this bait and switch, will see the proof in their pocketbooks and wallets. They will see the result of this consummately partisan measure rammed through without regular order, without real consideration, without the scrutiny that it needs and deserves, without public and popular support, if we move ahead, as the Republican leadership apparently appears intent on doing. Now is the time for us to show some backbone. I urge my colleagues to do it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise this evening to speak about tax reform, which is so important for families in Nebraska and throughout this country. The last time Congress comprehensively reformed the tax code was in 1986, and we all agree it is long overdue. My priorities for tax reform have always been threefold: delivering relief to the middle class, unleashing small business growth, and making our country competitive globally. This bill before us accomplishes these goals. American families have struggled over the past decade, and too many in our country have found themselves living paycheck to paycheck. Wages for workers have stagnated, while the price of goods and services have continued to climb. Things are only just starting to turn around. And as I travel across my state, Nebraskans have begun to tell me they are finally feeling confident about the economy again. That needs to continue, and the best way to do it is by putting more money back into the pockets of regular Americans. This bill does that in one of the best ways possible, by doubling the standard deduction and protecting the first $24,000 that married couples earn and the first $12,000 individuals earn from federal taxes. Increasing the standard deduction is pro-family, and it helps to foster the American dream. It not only leads to Americans keeping more of their hard-earned money, but it also means that simplifying the code will help them save money in tax preparation as well. According to the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, a married couple with 2 kids making $85,000 per year will see their taxes decrease by $2,224. This reform provides money that will allow Americans to plan for their future and to pay their bills. It can be a down payment on a house, or it can be put away for future college tuition or for retirement. It gives millions of earners more empowerment to use these savings for their lives as they see fit. Simplifying the code isn't the only family-focused provision included in this legislation. The Senate bill doubles the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000 per child. According to the Department of Agriculture, parents of a child born in 2015 are likely to spend more than $233,000 raising a child to age 17. That doesn't even include college tuition. Doubling the child tax credit will allow families to keep up to an additional $4,000 every year if they have 2 children or more. This credit builds a stronger future by helping families all across our country keep more money to raise happy and healthy children. In addition to these changes, this legislation will preserve many other popular deductions. This includes the charitable deduction, medical expense deduction, the student loan interest deduction, the mortgage interest deduction, and the low-income housing tax credit. This bill also continues popular savings programs, such as the 401ks and individual retirement accounts. These saving incentives are key tools that allow individuals to provide for their families and to prepare for retirement. It empowers Americans to plan ahead. There are also common sense provisions in this bill that have been overlooked during the current debate. These are changes everyone here can agree are long overdue. For example, this reform takes away the tax-exempt status for professional sports leagues. Now, we all love sports, but professional sports leagues like the NFL and the PGA, they shouldn't be allowed to use exemptions for nonprofits to avoid paying taxes. These are for-profit leagues where commissioners make tens of millions of dollars. They should be treated for what they are, and that's a money-making enterprise. I also want to take the time to address a misconception. Some have argued that this bill will tax the tuition waivers graduate students receive from their universities as a part of attending to their studies. There is no such provision. PhD research is a staple of higher education, and it drives our nation's innovation. It helps us better understand our world and often leads to incredible technological advancements. We in the Senate support graduate studies, and none of us want to make it more difficult to obtain graduate degrees or do research at the highest levels. We will not be taxing you for tuition you don't pay while earning a master's or doctorate degree. There are some other important provisions in this bill that haven't gotten the attention they deserve, and I want to take a moment to discuss some of them. The Senate tax reform retains nearly all of the education incentives that are present in the current tax code for students and for teachers. For example, we keep the HOPE credit, which allows taxpayers a credit of up to $2,500 per student per year for qualified tuition or related expenses. We also keep both the Coverdell and the 529 education savings accounts. These accounts promote saving for school, and they help parents prepare for future tuition. Finally, we double the educator deduction, which helps teachers make their classrooms as friendly for learning as possible. This is a pro-education tax reform bill, and it acknowledges education is a key to our country's future success. Mr. President, we must also recognize that our economy has changed over the last few decades, and our tax code, well, it needs to catch up to the times. We have the chance to make history, one that will help working families. My Strong Families Act, which is included in this legislation, would be the first nationwide paid family leave policy in American history. If we want to build a better future for our children, we better tackle problems for families, juggling those responsibilities between home and the workplace. This plan has the potential to make life much easier for working families across our country by providing a tax credit as large as 25% for employers who offer up to 12 weeks of paid family leave to their employees. Under programs set up by employers, employees would be able to take an hour, a day, or weeks off for purposes like taking care of a sick child or an ailing parent to make sure they get to a doctor's appointment. They could also take maternity or paternity leave to bond with a newborn or a recently adopted child. In 21st century America, the number of dual-income households is on the rise. According to the Department of Labor, 70% of mothers with children under 19 participate in the labor force, with over 75% employed full-time. For those without the means to take unpaid time off, the burdens of caregiving, they are a real burden. A recent study from Pew Research Center found that most individuals who make higher salaries usually have access to some kind of paid family leave. But those making less than that, they are not always covered. This is why my paid family leave plan limits eligibility to those earning below $72,000 per year. We want these benefits to target hourly and low-salaried workers. We want to increase access to paid family leave for those who need it the most. While my friends on the other side of the aisle focus on the stick approach to paid family leave, pushing mandates or the creation of new government programs, this bill pursues the carrot approach. And Americans agree with us. A recent study showed that 87% of Americans supported a limited government approach that enables employers to provide the benefit themselves. It's not hard to understand why. The plan balances the need of 21st century workers with the real-world challenges that small businesses face today. Eric Dinger, who's the CEO of a Lincoln startup named Powderhook, he put it the best. Eric told me, "I want to offer my employees paid leave, but a mandate forcing me to do so would be hard. I have to make payroll. The Strong Family Act is much more workable and wouldn't provide a disincentive to hire anyone." I agree. Another of my constituents, Allison Ritter, an employee at Applied Systems Incorporated in Lincoln, is helping her company's leadership develop a paid leave policy. In reaction to my bill being included in the tax reform proposal before us, she told me that this concept would change the game for many newborn babies and their parents, allowing them the time they need to bond and establish a nursing routine without as much of the stress and guilt they face today. It would provide families with the financial support they need in order to do what's best for their family, but also help businesses that struggle with putting a plan in place due to the financial burden extended absences create. Our country wins when we focus on and invest in healthier families. Sarah Rasby, who is the co-owner of Lotus House of Yoga, which has locations across my state, agreed. "It is refreshing to see a policy that supports the family and small business unit," she said. "As co-owner of a small business and a mother of 2 young children, I know firsthand how challenging it can be without paid leave. A mother and/or family needs time to adjust and bond. This bill will help parents, families,
and small business owners be more at ease with the transitions and the changes that come with maternity leave. Additionally, it will create more community awareness on the importance of supporting the family structure through policy. We need to get this done for people like Eric, Allison, and Sarah, and other business owners, caregivers, and working parents throughout the country. Mr. President, I also said my goal in this process is to promote policies that will ensure small businesses succeed. There are over 29 million small businesses throughout our country, and these small firms, they drive our economy. They have generated over 60% of the new jobs created over the last 2 decades and have made up nearly 98% of our exports. They are often the face of our country to the world. This reform will provide small businesses with additional incentives to invest and grow. When small businesses make money, they invest it back into their businesses and help grow their local economy. Places like Lincoln and Omaha are well known to the entrepreneurial community as bustling hubs of innovation. This bill provides a 17.4% deduction for the large majority of small businesses, which will lower their tax bills and give them more financial flexibility. The preservation of things like the 1031 like-kind exchanges and the stepped-up basis will further help our small businesses, especially agriculture businesses. Small businesses don't have the professional resources to deal with a tax code that comes in at over 74,000 pages. Simply doing taxes, let alone paying them, has become a burden on too many of our small companies. Moreover, they cannot take advantage of all the corporate deductions or the little-known loopholes like big companies can. This is not fair. It hurts our competitiveness globally, stifles strong economic growth, and it favors big corporations, which have offices full of lawyers and accountants. This tax reform lessens this disparity and deserves support from everyone who wants to promote American entrepreneurialism. Lastly, this legislation goes a long way toward making America competitive internationally. A large part of this is lowering the corporate tax rate. At 35%, America's corporate tax rate is a full 13 percentage points higher than the average rate of our competitors from the developed world. This is a big reason why companies are fleeing our shores and they're choosing to set up their headquarters or invest outside of America. These so-called inversions have been on the rise in recent years, and there's little reason to think that trend will reverse if we stand by and do nothing. This legislation will put us in line with our trading partners and once again make America an attractive place for business, which will lead to more jobs and higher wages for our country.
The Senator from Oregon.
I ask unanimous consent to speak for 3 minutes to wrap up on the first vote we're going to have on my motion.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, this first motion, the first motion the Senate is going to vote on, is a straightforward proposition. The motion says, let us send this bill back to the Senate Finance Committee on a bipartisan basis and come up with a plan that actually works for the middle class. And I'm going to wrap up just by recapping the Republican rhetoric on this tax plan. First, it was said to be a guaranteed middle-class tax cut. Then it was merely focused on the middle class. Next, it was an average tax cut across a variety of income cohorts. But now the numbers are actually in. Republicans want to run up enough red ink to threaten Medicare and Social Security and still raise taxes on more than half of the middle class. The Senate, on a bipartisan basis, can do better than this. I urge my colleagues to support this proposal to send the bill back to the Finance Committee and come up on a bipartisan basis with tax reform that actually works for the middle class, and I yield back.
The questions on the motion?
Ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Strange, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Durbin, Harris, Heinrich, Kane, King, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, Merkley, Murray, Nelson, Schatz, Shaheen, and Wyden. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Burr, Corker, Cornyn, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Isaacson, Johnson, Lee, Moran, Paul, and Tillis. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper. Aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts. No. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker. Aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth. Aye. Mr. Brasso. Mr. Brasso. No. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. No. Mr. Young. Mr. Young. No. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy. No. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio. No. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. No. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy. No. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo. No. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito. No. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders. Aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters. Aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren. Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. No. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall. Aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller. No. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. No. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker. No. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman. No. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow. Aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly. Aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. No. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds. No. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. No. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey. No. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott. No. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton. No. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Strange, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake, no. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no.
Are there any members in the chamber who wish to vote or change their vote on this vote? The yeas are 48, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
On behalf of Senators Hatch and Murkowski, I call up amendment number 1618.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Senator from Kentucky, Mr. McConnell, for Mr. Hatch, proposes an amendment number 1618.
I ask the reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that following leader remarks on Thursday, November 30, the Senate resume consideration of H.R. 1 with 1 hour debate remaining on the Hatch-Murkowski amendment. I further ask that any debate time tonight count against the underlying bill.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that a correction to appointments made on November 28, 2007 be printed in the record.
Without objection.
For the information of the Senate, this correction is clerical and does not change membership of the Frederick Douglass Bicentennial Commission made by the appointments.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of SRS 344 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 344, honoring the life and achievements of Dr. Robert Lawrence, Jr.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I further ask the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 228, which was received from the House.
The clerk will report the measure.
H.R. 228, an act to amend the Indian Employment, Training, and Related Services Demonstration Act of 1992, and so forth, and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time and passed. The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 30, S254.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 30, S254, a bill to amend the Native American Programs Act of 1974, and so forth.
Objection to proceeding? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Hoven Amendment, which is at the desk, be agreed to. The bill be amended, as amended, be considered read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 33, S302.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 33, S302, a bill to enhance tribal road safety and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time and passed. The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 104, S245.
Clerk will report.
Calendar number 104, S245, a bill to amend the Indian Tribal Energy Development and Self-Determination Act of 2005 and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill is considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 105, S343.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 105, S343, a bill to repeal certain obsolete laws relating to Indians.
Is there objection to proceeding? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time and passed. The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 193, S669.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 193, S669, a bill to authorize the Secretary of the Interior to assess sanitation and safety conditions at Bureau of Indian Affairs facilities and so forth and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Hoven Amendment at the desk be agreed to. The bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 209, S772.
Clerk will report.
Calendar number 209, S772, a bill to amend the PROTECT Act to make Indian tribes eligible for Amber Alert grants.
Is there objection to proceeding? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 247, S825.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 247, SA 25, a bill to provide for the conveyance of certain property to the Southeast Alaska Regional Health Consortium located in Sitka, Alaska, and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding the measure? Without objection.
Ask unanimous consent. The committee reported substitute amendment be agreed to. The bill is amended be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Ask unanimous consent. The Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 249, S1285.
Clerk will report.
Calendar number 249, S1285, a bill to allow the Confederated Tribes to lease or transfer certain lands.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Ask unanimous consent. The committee reported amendments be agreed to. The bill is amended be considered read a third time and passed. The committee reported title amendment be agreed to, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent when the Senate completes its business today at adjournment from 10:30 a.m. Thursday, November 30th. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. Finally, following leader remarks, the Senate resumed consideration of H.R. 1 under the previous order.
Objection.
So if there's no further business come before the Senate, I ask to stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of Senators Portman, Van Hollen, Warren, and Wyden.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for 6 additional full-floor access passes to be equally divided between the minority and majority during consideration of H.R. 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act legislation, for the following staffers: Majority Finance Committee, Randy Herndon, Zach Rudisil, Shay Hawkins; Minority Finance Committee, Ryan Abraham, Adam Caruso, and Sarah Schneider.
Without objection.
Tonight I want to talk about an opportunity we have before us here in the United States Senate, and that is for tax reform that can truly help our economy and help the middle-class families we represent. It's a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The last time we reformed our tax code in any substantial way was 31 years ago. Ronald Reagan was president. Pete Rose was still playing for the Cincinnati Reds. That's how long ago it was. But that 1986 tax reform gave our economy a much-needed shot in the arm. And it led to more jobs and higher wages in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, 31 years later, after a decade of disappointing growth and flat wages, we need that shot in the arm again. We need a tax code that better reflects the needs of today's workers, today's families, and our 21st century economy. There's bipartisan agreement that the tax code is broken, hopelessly broken, and it's up to Congress to fix it. No one else can. Through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act now before us, we've got a chance here in the Congress to create a better economy and a better future. And we've got to get this done for the people we represent. It starts with tax cuts for the middle class. While the economy has seen some improvement recently, and I saw some good numbers today for last quarter's growth, the people I represent, hardworking Ohioans, people across the country, are not feeling these benefits of a growing economy. For more than a decade now, expenses have increased, including health care costs, which have increased the highest, at a time when wages have been flat. When you take wages when you take inflation into account, wages have stayed relatively flat for almost 2 decades. That increase in expenses and flat wages is the middle class squeeze, and people are feeling it. For years, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have been calling for middle-class tax cuts to help ease this burden. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will actually deliver it. The proposal helps us in a lot of ways, but 3 main ways. First, it has a doubling of the standard deduction. This is a doubling for families of $12,000 to $24,000. This means for a lot of families in America, the first $24,000 is a zero tax bracket. 2/3 of Ohioans, by the way, already use the standard deduction. And the estimate is, now that we're doubling it, that over 90% of Ohioans will use that standard deduction. That helps to keep the tax bill down, but it also is a tremendous simplification of our tax code. Second is the doubling of the child tax credit. That's in this legislation. The American dream starts with the American family. and parents shouldn't have to reconsider starting a family because of the financial burden that comes with it. This doubling of the child tax credit will help working families afford child care and will help strengthen middle-class family budgets all across the country. And by the way, it also includes increasing the refundability of that tax credit for taxpayers who don't have any income tax liability. Third, of course, is lowering tax rates. And there are tax rates that are lowered all across the board for middle-class families. The Independent Tax Foundation estimates that the tax cuts in this proposal will save an Ohio family at the median income level $2,375 a year. That almost $2,400 a year is a big deal. A lot of the people I represent and others represent here in this chamber are living paycheck to paycheck, and this matters. More money staying in the pockets of working families to make that car payment, to pay for health care, maybe put a little money aside for retirement is a big deal. We also know from the Tax Foundation that the lower rates in this plan will benefit families across middle-class income brackets. For example, a family with 2 kids making $50,000 a year will see a 36% tax break, 36% reduction in their tax liability. For a family with 2 kids making about $85,000 a year, there's a 20% reduction in their tax liability. And for a family with 2 kids making about $165,000 a year, there's an 8% reduction in their tax liability. So there's tax relief across the board, but the biggest proportional tax cut goes to the folks who need it the most. This chart shows this. For people who are in these income categories, 20,000 to 50,000, 50 to 100,000, 100,000 and above, right now paying 4.3% of taxes from 20,000 to 50,000 under this proposal. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation and the Tax Foundation, it goes down to 4.1%. So the burden is reduced for people at the lower end. From 50,000 to 100,000, the burden is also lowered from 6.9% to 16.9% to 16.7%. For those people 100,000 and above, the burden right now is about 78.7%. The top 10% of wage earners pay about 70% of the taxes. That actually goes up from 78.7 to 78.9. So this notion that we've heard today that somehow these middle-class tax cuts are not proportionally helping those at the lower end, that's simply not true. This is the data. Go on JCT, Joint Committee on Taxation.gov, look for yourself. Go on the Tax Foundation site and you can look at your family income, look at your situation, and determine how doubling the standard deduction, doubling the child tax credit, and reducing tax rates will benefit you. The biggest proportional tax cuts, again, go to people who need it the most. In total, by the way, when these tax cuts are implemented, it is estimated that approximately 3 million Americans who are currently paying taxes will no longer be paying income taxes. They'll be off the rolls altogether. That's tax cuts for middle-class families, for families who need it the most. Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have suggested that our plan will hurt families with incomes under $30,000 because there is a Joint Committee on Taxation report that, because of arcane budget rules, counts repealing the individual mandate as a tax hike. This is an interesting perspective, but I reject it because I don't think stopping the Obamacare individual mandate and people choosing not to buy health insurance and therefore not having both the cost of the Affordable Care Act and the Obamacare tax credits that come with that health care is a tax hike. In other words, what they're saying is because somebody doesn't choose to buy health care, partly because it's too expensive, and therefore doesn't get the tax credits that come with that, that somehow that's a tax hike. That doesn't make sense to me, and I don't think it makes sense to most Americans. What the Joint Committee on Taxation did say repeatedly at our committee markup 2 weeks ago is that when you don't consider this issue, again, choosing not to buy health care insurance a hike, that our plan does give every single income group, including those under $30,000, a tax cut. As noted earlier, the biggest percentage tax cuts, again, goes to those with lower incomes. And that's appropriate. Those are the folks who need it the most. What we do know is that the individual mandate right now is an onerous tax by itself. The Supreme Court has called it a tax. It's a tax on people that disproportionately affects lower and middle income class Americans. In fact, 80% of the individual mandate falls on folks making less than $50,000 a year in their family. In Ohio, by the way, that figure is about 83%. 83% of that individual mandate tax falls on people in households at less than $50,000 a year. So getting rid of this penalty removes the financial burden unfairly affecting those working families, and then we use the savings from that the Congressional Budget Office says we get from this to increase the child tax credit and to reduce tax rates on the middle class. That's one reason we have better middle class tax cuts in our bill. So providing immediate relief to the family budget is incredibly important. But beyond that, the tax reforms on the business side will make American workers and companies more competitive, create more jobs and better wages, and that, to me, is just as important in terms of helping middle-class families in my home state of Ohio. Why? Because when you reform the business tax code to make it competitive, the benefit goes to workers and working-class families all over this country. The U.S. has the highest corporate tax rate now in the industrialized world. One study by the bipartisan or nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that workers bear 70% of the burden of our corporate tax rate being so high. Others say it's less than that. Others say it's more than that. But all say that workers benefit. If we lower that rate below the average of the other industrialized countries, our workers will benefit through higher wages and better benefits. And by the way, that benefits middle-class families well beyond these direct tax cuts that we were talking about earlier. A recent study by Ernst & Young, the accounting firm, said that if we had had the tax rate that we have in this proposal, a 20% tax rate on these businesses, if we'd had that in place since 2004, there would be 4,700 more U.S. companies today. Let me repeat that. They're saying that 4,700 companies that were American companies have become foreign companies because of our tax code. And if we had put in place these changes back 13 years ago, those companies would still be American companies, hiring more American workers and investing more money here. We did some research on this, some investigation in the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations over the past few years, and we determined that, in fact, when companies are taken over by a foreign company because of our tax code, or when U.S. companies choose to go overseas and invert because of our tax code, what happens? We lose jobs, and we lose investment here in this country. It matters, and it matters a lot to the communities where those employees are lost and where those businesses have left. The 20% tax rate is going to be more jobs and more investment coming right here to this country instead of going overseas. It's also true that there'll be more foreign investment here. Companies now that are trying to decide, are they going to invest in America or are they in some other country with a lower tax rate and with the expensing we have in this bill to be able to write down new investments that they're making, is going to encourage them to make an investment here in the United States rather than other countries. That will increase jobs too. The Tax Foundation estimates, by the way, that because of this new investment, the higher productivity that comes with it, because of this tax reform proposal, we will create nearly 1 million new American jobs and more than 35,000 jobs alone in my home state of Ohio. In addition to providing relief for middle-class families and making this business rate more competitive for American companies and workers, the tax reform does a lot to level the playing field internationally. This is really important. Right now, American workers are forced to compete with one hand tied behind their back because of our tax code. A broken tax code is something that must be fixed because it's irresponsible to tell the American worker, you've got to get out there and compete, but guess what? Your foreign competitor has a big advantage over you. It's crazy that Congress has allowed this opportunity to go by for so many years. The situation where companies are actually encouraged to move overseas and keep their profits overseas makes no sense. Right now, it's estimated there's between $2.5 trillion and $3 trillion of earnings trapped overseas because of this outdated tax code. Think about that. That money can come back here and be invested here in plant and jobs and equipment. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act says to those companies, we want your money back here. We want you to invest in America. The result will lift the economic condition of our entire country. This week, 137 of the country's leading economists wrote in an open letter to Congress in support of this tax reform bill. These former heads of government economic agencies, leaders of economic policy groups, and leading academics said, quite simply, and I quote, economic growth will accelerate if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passes, leading to more jobs, higher wages, and a better standard of living for the American people. That's 137 economists in an open letter. I encourage you to take a look at it online. These are people who understand what the impact's going to be of policy we make here on decisions that are being made all around the country. We can debate the exact growth amount that will result from this bill, and we'll have a spirited debate on that this week. But we all have to agree that this will help to grow the economy if we're following basic economic theory. And by the way, their letter also states, and I quote, $1 trillion in new tax revenue for the federal government can be generated by a 0.4% increase in GDP growth, end quote. In other words, what they're saying is that if there's just a slight increase in economic growth because of this tax reform bill compared to the number we have to use here, that this will result in actual new revenue coming into the government to pay down the debt. I'm convinced that's going to happen for a very simple reason. We have to use a very low number of economic growth. Under our rules, we have to use a CBO, Congressional Budget Office number, of 1.9% economic growth over the next 10 years. By the way, the average over the past 30 years has been 2.5%. The average last quarter, we just learned today, was 3.3%. The average the quarter before that, the second quarter, was 3.1%. This tax reform proposal will help to actually increase economic growth, but even if you don't believe that, 1.9% economic growth is unacceptable. We cannot accept that as a country. We can and must do better than that, and we will do better than that, and this tax reform proposal will be one reason. So I'm convinced that the 0.4 increase up to 2.3% is still very conservative, and that we will be able to do better than that, as we have over the past 30 years, as we have traditionally in this country. When you hear my colleagues on the other side talk about this bill being bad for the deficit, I think you ought to think about that. This means that they are resigning themselves to 1.9% economic growth. That, to me, is not acceptable for our country, and I don't think that's what we will see. Of the $44 trillion in new revenue estimated to be coming in over the next 10 years, yes, out of that amount, we're suggesting $1.5 trillion be a tax cut relative to that, again, very low economic growth of 1.9%. About a third of that, by the way, is by simply using what we should use, which is the right policy baseline. So you end up with about $1 trillion in tax relief. And again, over 10 years with $44 trillion coming in, and again with what the economists are saying about it generating more revenue through economic growth, I'm convinced we're going to do better than that 1.9%. I believe the pro-growth changes in this bill will help drive economic growth in ways that it helps every American family. We are in a position now, if we pass this bill, to be able to help all the people who are now looking at a tough time. Making ends meet is difficult for a lot of people living paycheck to paycheck, but also it'll help to grow the economy generally. Businesses and organizations all around the country are supporting this legislation because they believe it is going to help American families. We have about 120 groups already, as of yesterday, who are supporting us. The National Federation of Independent Businesses, which is the group that represents most of the small businesses in America. The Family Business Council, representing, again, a lot of small businesses that benefit greatly from the changes we have, not just with the corporation rate, but also with how we deal with companies that are considered to be pass-through companies, the smaller companies. The National Retail Federation is strongly in support of this bill. The Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council all support this reform plan and the opportunities it has to create more economic growth for small businesses, to let them be more competitive. So you can look at some of the groups here, some of the roughly 120 groups that are supporting this legislation. Why? Because they know it's going to help. Big businesses will benefit and be more competitive, therefore their workers can compete. Small businesses are going to be able, through these pro-growth policies, to grow and be able to be more entrepreneurial, to be able to come up with more innovations, and to be able to expand employment. We can also estimate the savings for the middle-class family in every tax bracket, as I said. But what can't be measured as easily is the economic boost this is going to have for everybody. We're giving families freedom to spend more of their own money how they see fit. We're putting faith in the American entrepreneurs and businesses to compete in a global market. We're bringing back some of that money that's locked up overseas. We're creating a fairer tax system that encourages jobs and investment here in this country rather than overseas. That's all good stuff. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is made in America, and it's made for America. We need to come together now as a Congress, and I hope we'll get support from the other side of the aisle as well to pass this once-in-a-generation legislation to benefit our country. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back my time.
President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, Senate Republicans are about 24 hours away from passing a bill that would make middle-class families in this country pay more taxes so that big corporations and millionaires can pay less. Now, a bill like that would never really make sense, but it really doesn't make sense right now. Since 1980, corporate profits have shot through the roof, while wages for working people have remained pretty much the same. And with corporate profits up and family incomes flat, who's paying the cost of running the government? Well, thanks to Congress, over the past 50 years, corporations have gone from picking up about 25% of what it costs to run the government to picking up about 9%. Or to say it another way, hardworking families now pick up a much bigger share of the cost of running our government. Now, I don't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. This just isn't fair. Corporations are wallowing in profits, while hard-pressed families are picking up the bill for our military, for our government agencies, for Homeland Security, for our infrastructure, and for everything else that we have to pitch in to pay for. And here comes the Republican tax bill, which would make a bad situation worse. The Republican tax bill would slash taxes on corporations even further and raise taxes on millions of working families. You know, it is hard to comprehend how deeply unfair that is. A survey released last May by the Federal Reserve found that 44% of American families, just a bit under half, don't have enough slack in their budget to cover a $400 emergency expense. If the transmission blows up, or if a kid gets sick, or if the fridge stops working, these families are just plain out of luck. And these are the same families that the Republicans have targeted to pay more in taxes under the Republican plan. In trying to sell a bill that is deeply unfair, Republicans have landed on a tried and true strategy. Just lie about it. The first big lie is that the plan will supercharge economic growth. Spoiler alert, it won't. We've seen this movie before, and we know how it ends. There is not one single credible projection that says this plan will have any meaningful impact on the growth of the American economy. One group of economists after another has looked at this bill and said it won't do a darn thing to help the economy grow. Even Wall Street banks, which stand to pocket billions of dollars in tax giveaways from this bill, have grudgingly had to admit that the bill won't lead to any growth. Barclays Bank said, quote, "A permanent boost to growth remains unlikely." And Goldman Sachs said, quote, "We find a boost to GDP growth of 0.1% to 0.2% in 2018 to 2019 and smaller amounts in subsequent years." Second big lie is that if we just give corporations more money, they will surely do us the favor of raising wages or creating more jobs. We've seen that movie before, too. Over the last 30 years, corporate profits have exploded, and companies have not trickled down those profits to workers. They didn't do it before, and they won't do it after the Republicans give away even more money to these giant corporations. But you don't have to take my word for it. The top executives at the companies have already admitted as much. Bank of America and Merrill Lynch surveyed 300 CEOs about what they would do with their tax giveaways. What are they going to do with those tax giveaways? Top 3 responses: pay down debt, buy back stock, fund new mergers. In other words, something for the banks, something for wealthy investors, and nothing for workers. The third big lie is that the plan won't increase the national debt. That's just plain false. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says this bill will tack on $1.4 trillion to the debt in the next 10 years. And we all know what comes next. The same Republican senators who will vote for this $1 trillion budget buster tomorrow will turn around and vote next week and say, our national debt is just too high, and we need to cut Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and education funding and affordable housing and you name it. In fact, the Republican budget they passed last month tees up more than $1 trillion in cuts to those very programs. This bill raises taxes on millions of middle-class families, and it doesn't create any real economic growth. It doesn't create any real job growth, and it explodes the national debt. So this bill clearly is not about helping working families. So you really have to stop and ask the question, what is it about? The answer is simple. This is about Republican senators paying off the rich corporate donors that helped get them elected. It's about the way that money has corrupted Washington. It is about wealthy donors investing a few $1 million in political contributions to secure billions of dollars in tax giveaways. Here's what one of my Republican colleagues said recently. If we don't pass a tax bill, quote, financial contributions will dry up. A Republican member of the House was even more blunt. He said on the record that his donors told him to pass this tax bill or don't ever call them again. In other words, Republicans have said to each other that they need to pass a tax giveaway to give their donors money in order to get reelected. This is a smash and grab job. The Republicans are looting the U.S. Treasury so that their donors will keep funding their reelection campaigns. They don't even try to hide the corruption, and they don't worry about how many middle-class families get hurt in the caper. My take on this is pretty simple. I don't think a single middle-class family in this country should pay more in taxes so that big corporations and millionaires can pay less. I think big corporations should pay more, not less, so that we can cut taxes on working families and small businesses, so that we can make investments in fixing our roads and our bridges and our power grid, and so that we can help young people reduce their student loan debt. This is about basic fairness. We can build an America where every kid has a shot at success, where every family has some measure of economic security, where every senior has enough savings to retire with dignity. We can do that, and we can start by defeating this Republican tax giveaway. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me start by thanking the Senator from Massachusetts for always telling it like it is, because what we've got before us here in the Senate is going to do grave harm to our country, not just next year and the year after, but for many years to come. We still have an opportunity, Mr. President, to stop that from happening through our votes tomorrow. Let me also say at the outset that we need to enact tax reform in the United States of America. We need to simplify, we need to streamline, we need to reform our tax code. We need to get rid of all of those tax loopholes that have been put in our tax code by powerful special interests that have been able to hire high-priced lobbyists and get something in our tax code not because it's good public policy, not because it's good for the majority of Americans, but because it's good for some group of special interests. So we need real tax reform. That's not what the bill in front of us does. What this bill does is take a tax code that is already stacked in favor of the most powerful and the most wealthy and rig it even more in favor of the most powerful and most wealthy. And that is hard to do. You have to work at doing that. And our Republican colleagues have succeeded in taking something that was already stacked in favor of those groups and making it even worse. And that, Mr. President, is why we see this effort to jam this bill through in the United States Senate in just a few weeks, because Our Republican colleagues know that the more the American public sees this bill, the more they will hate this bill, the more they will realize that it's going to mean their taxes going up in many cases and harm to the American economy. You know, we debated the effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act in the Senate, not for a long, long time, but at least over a couple-month period. And what happened is that debate went on, more and more people around the country engaged, and all the nurses and all the doctors and all the hospitals, and I mean rural hospitals, suburban hospitals, urban hospitals, they all said that's bad for our health care. And this Senate, at the end of the day, did the right thing. Unfortunately, the lesson learned was not to get the input from the American public, but try to rush something through before people could figure out exactly what's in it. And that's what's happening here in the Senate today and tomorrow. And just as one example of the harm this bill will do that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, I want to talk about what this bill does in its changes to how we tax U.S. corporations that have operations overseas. These are big multinational corporations that have operations in the United States, but also have the ability to move their plant and equipment overseas and hire people overseas instead of hiring Americans here at home. And there's a provision in this Senate Republican bill that's going to dramatically increase the incentives for U.S. multinational corporations to move operations and jobs overseas. And here's why. Because under this bill, American corporations that are doing business here in the United States will pay a 20% corporate tax rate. It reduces the corporate tax rate down to 20%. But it also says something else. If you're an American corporation and you move your operations overseas, the earnings, the profits you make on your overseas operations pay 0% U.S. tax rate. So immediately, you have an incentive to move your business from Baltimore City or from any other city in this country or any other place in this country to another place that has a lower tax rate. So, for example, Ireland has a 12.5% tax rate. So you move your business to Ireland, you're going to be paying 12.5% on your profits instead of the 20% you're paying here. You move to Hungary, you're going to pay 9% on the profits you earn in Hungary, whereas you would have paid 20% on your profits if you keep those operations here in the United States. So immediately, you have an incentive to move those operations overseas. And even if you move those operations to a country that has a higher tax rate than, say, Ireland or Hungary, there are easy ways to put those profits that you earn in a place like the UK or Japan and put them in a lower tax area like the Cayman Islands or Bermuda. So this right off the bat creates a perverse additional incentive to put American jobs overseas. So our Republican colleagues say, okay, not to worry. We have a fix to this issue. We're going to create this minimum U.S. tax on large profits of overseas operations. In other words, if you're a U.S. corporation, you move to Ireland, you can make a certain amount of money there, but if you go over a certain amount, we're going to put a minimum American tax on top of the tax you pay in Ireland. The problem, Mr. President, this is a problem when you rush through a bill like this. The problem is the cure is worse than the disease, and here's why. You'll look at this chart. Okay, first thing you say is, you know, there's a lower tax rate in Ireland than in Baltimore City, so I'm going to move some of my operations overseas, my plant and equipment. In fact, I'm going to move $10 million of investment overseas in Ireland. Now, in Ireland, I'm going to be paying 12.5% on my profits versus 20% here in the United States. So, hey, that's a pretty good move. Now let's see if this minimum tax has any impact and what the impact will be. Well, what the Republican tax bill says is that if your earnings overseas exceed 10% of your investment in tangible property. What's tangible property? Plant, equipment, your factory. So if you spend $10 million and move your plant and equipment and factory overseas, you're going to be able to make a 10% profit there with no additional U.S. tax. But if you earn more than that, let's say you earn $1,200,000 instead of a 10% return, which would have been $1 million. Aha! Now this minimum tax applies, but just to that excess profit. So you're now going to pay the lower tax rate in Ireland on your first $1 million, but you're going to pay this 10% U.S. surtax of $200,000. 10% on the $200,000, so you're going to pay $20,000 U.S. taxes. So what if you don't want to pay even that? And here's what is so outrageous about this bill. I don't know if it's intentional or unintentional. If I'm a U.S. corporation, the way I fix this problem, I move another $10 million worth of plant and equipment out of Maryland into Ireland. Because when I do that, and so now I've got my first $10 million investment that I moved from Baltimore to Ireland, and I'm going to move another one. Now, as long as I keep my overall returns at 10%, I'm not going to pay any of that excess minimum tax. And so if my first company has a 12% return, say the second one has an 8% return, together they have a 10% return. So I end up, by moving more plant and equipment from the state of Maryland to Ireland, I don't even pay that minimum tax, that minimum U.S. tax. And in fact, every time I get close to having to pay that minimum U.S. tax, I can solve my problem by moving more American jobs overseas. That is insane, Mr. President, and I hope our colleagues will take a look at this, because this is going to do great damage to the American economy. And you don't have to take my word for it. You got a lot of economists that have taken a look at this provision. I'm just going to read from one. His name is Edward Kleinbard. He was the former chief of staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation. We all know that committee is they're the professionals, they're the nonpartisan professionals that analyze these bills. Here's what he had to say. Quote, "The administration's tax cut proposal is coupled with the territorial tax system, which permanently exempts foreign income from taxation. This will further tilt the playing field in favor of foreign rather than U.S. investment." Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the other quotations from economists be entered in the record. Thank you, Mr. President.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, to add insult to injury, this is not the only part of this bill that actually tips the playing field in favor of our economic competitors overseas and against the American worker and against the American taxpayer. Because if you look at the corporate tax cuts in this bill, they are permanent. They go on forever. Year after year, corporations will get that tax cut in the United States of America, whereas if you're an individual household in America, millions of middle-class taxpayers will see an immediate increase in their taxes. Some will see a small cut in their taxes for a period of time, but in the long run, those individuals' tax cuts go away. The corporate tax rate cuts go on forever. And of course, the theory behind this is trickle-down economics, right? You're going to give the very wealthy and big corporations this tax cut, and the benefits of that are going to trickle down and lift everybody up. Mr. President, I think we know that that theory has run aground and run into the wall of reality many times over. Most recently, in the early 2000s, we had the Bush tax cuts. Same theory. Cut taxes for the super wealthy, and somehow the benefits are going to trickle down and lift everybody up. I'll tell you who it lifted up. The wealthy did even better. The other thing that went up was our deficit and debt. But everybody else, they were either running in place or falling behind. That was our most recent experiment in trickle down. But we also have an immediate present example of why this theory that giving big tax cuts to corporations, the idea that it's going to raise wages, is just dead wrong, because as we sit here tonight, American corporations are making record profits. And that's a great thing. But guess what? Wages are flat. So increasing the after-tax profits of those corporations, they're not going to use that extra money to raise wages. They're not doing it today. They're not doing it today. Stock market will go up. Stockholders will definitely have greater value because, hey, you're a corporation. The day after this tax bill gets passed, if it passes, your after-tax profits just went up. Stock market's doing great. Problem is, most Americans, the overwhelming number of Americans, don't benefit from that rising stock market. The people who benefit most, we know, are the folks at the very top. And here's the thing that I think many people will be surprised by, Mr. President. A very large group of those stockholders, they're not even American citizens. They're foreign stockholders, stockholders who have these investments in American corporations. In fact, 35% of the stockholders in these corporations are foreign shares. 35% of the value of that stock. So I can tell you they're going to be clinking the champagne glasses in capitals around the world because those very wealthy foreigners, they're going to get a big tax cut. In fact, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy estimates that the value of the tax cut to foreign stockholders just in the year 2019 will be over $30 billion. That's in 1 year. Foreign stockholders. In that same year, taxes will go up by over $27 billion on American citizens in the year 2019. So, it's just great news for the American public. $27 billion transferred from American households into the pockets of foreign stockholders. What a great deal for the American public. They're going to be thrilled to see that their hard-earned dollars are going to increase the bank accounts of foreign stockholders. And this is the kind of information, Mr. President, that is beginning to come out as people get a chance to look more about the consequences of this bill. This is the exact reason that Republicans are trying to rush this through the United States Senate, because I can tell you when the American public sees this, that their taxes are going up to pay for foreign stockholders, I think all of us agree they aren't going to like that. So the problem is this is also part of a pattern. Because the corporate tax cuts go on forever, those foreign stockholders, they keep getting every year. This is just in 2019. They keep getting a big windfall, a big bonanza. But if you're an American taxpayer, you're on the short end of the stick, because millions of American families, middle-class families, will see their taxes go up right away. As I said, others may see a small tax cut originally, but it will fizzle out. So here's the overall impact. In 2019, you're going to see 13 million American families who earn less than $200,000 a year pay higher taxes under this Republican bill. 13 million families. And it gets worse from there, because the benefits that some people will get in the short term begin to fizzle out and then get snuffed out altogether at the end of 10 years. So by the year 2025, it's going to go from 13 middle-class American families to 19 million middle-class families who are going to be paying higher taxes. By the way, at the same time, the Republican bill will give a tax cut of an average of $40,000 a year to people who make more than $1 million a year. And it gets even worse for families in and after the year 2025, because all the individual tax cuts expire. Tax cuts for the foreign stockholders, they keep going on. They go on forever. By 2027, the Republican plan will raise taxes on 87 million American families. Now, Mr. President, we actually just had some information come out, just released to the public this evening. This is from the Joint Tax Committee, Joint Committee on Taxation. These are the folks who are the professionals who look at the impact of the tax bill. They analyze it and they let people know the facts. Here's what they say. When this bill runs its course in the year 2027, here's the bottom line. 23% of Americans, households, are going to see their taxes go up. 16% will see their taxes go down. So more American households see their taxes go up than go down. 61%, they estimate, see virtually no change at all. And again, these are families, not corporations. The corporations, including those foreign stockholders, they keep seeing the benefits. Now, here's the other thing the Joint Committee on Taxation is telling us, that of the people who get a cut, you see the largest share in any one group are people who make $1 million and up. In fact, it says that of those in that category, 57% of the households will get a tax cut. Those are the millionaires. If you look at middle-income folks, much smaller percentages in those categories. Now, Mr. President, I just have to ask my colleagues how it is that can try to sell a plan as a middle-class tax cut when at the end of the day, a majority of Americans, more Americans are going to see their taxes go up than go down. And I think the American people are going to be more and more surprised if this bill passes as to what's in it. So we have a chance to actually step back right now. We have a chance to step back and actually take a good look at the bill, and we can figure out which of these consequences are intended and which of these consequences are unintended. And there's time to fix some of these issues. The last point I want to make, Mr. President, is that in addition to middle-class families, millions of them who are going to have to pay more to pay for the big corporate tax cut, you're also going to see a number of other groups of Americans that are going to get hit hard. So we know that millions of people who get their health insurance through the exchanges are going to see their premiums go up to pay for big tax cuts for corporations. And we know even after all that, after those Americans have to pay more in premiums, after millions of middle-class families are going to have to pay more, you still got a $1.5 trillion debt. And I'm just going to ask my Republican colleagues who I've worked with for many years and have agreed with them that we need to find a bipartisan way to reduce our deficits and debt rather than increase our deficits and debt, what their plan is. And here's the secret. Not really a secret, actually. I invite everybody to look at the budget that passed the Senate and the House of Representatives, because it tells you right there in the budget what the plan is to reduce some of that debt that will be increased because of tax cuts. And the proposal's right there. $1 trillion cut to Medicaid over 10 years, $473 billion cut to Medicare over 10 years, and cuts to the whole category of our budget we use to invest in education. So the bottom line, Mr. President, is that this bill is going to provide whopping tax cuts to corporations. It's going to have the effect of encouraging and incentivizing more of those corporations to move jobs, plant, and equipment overseas. And it's going to ask almost everybody else in the country to pick up the tab. That is not the kind of tax reform that the American people bargained for. And I urge my colleagues to take a step back, work together on a bipartisan basis, and come up with a plan that actually works for the country. I hope that can happen, and Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow. 10:30 tomorrow. Amen to that.